Victor Malone, a 78-year-old retired widower, spent every penny of his meager pension collecting rare, vintage toys. His small, cluttered house brimmed with shelves of action figures, antique dolls, and tin robots. His neighbors mocked him, calling him a delusional hoarder. But Victor wasn't collecting for himself. He was keeping a heartbreaking promise made decades ago. What happens when his secret is finally revealed will shatter even the coldest of hearts. Victor Malone, a quiet man in the twilight of his years, spent his days surrounded by mountains of old toys. His small, aging house, tucked away on the outskirts of a town that had long stopped noticing him, was a haven for dusty action figures, rusted tin robots, porcelain dolls, and colorful model cars. For anyone passing by, it looked like the clutter of a hoarder, a man with no rhyme or reason to his madness. But to Victor, every toy told a story. Every collectible whispered a purpose that only he could understand. Victor wasn't always this way. He had once been a man of stature, a factory supervisor who prided himself on precision and discipline. His life had been one of structure, long hours, strict schedules, and an unwavering focus on providing for his family. His wife, Eleanor, had often scolded him for working too much, for missing family dinners and school plays. But Victor had always brushed it off, telling her he was doing it all for their future, for their son, Max. Max, his only child, had adored toys. As a boy, he would spend hours sprawled on the living room carpet, creating elaborate adventures with his action figures. His favorites were the spacemen, tiny astronauts he imagined exploring galaxies far beyond the confines of their modest home. "Dad, one day we'll have the biggest toy collection in the world," Max had once exclaimed, his eyes sparkling with the boundless enthusiasm of youth. Victor had chuckled and ruffled the boy's hair. "One day, son," he had promised. But that day never came. Life, as it often does, got in the way. Deadlines, overtime shifts, and the ever-present need to make ends meet consumed Victor's time. The promise of a shared toy collection faded into the background, buried beneath bills and responsibilities. Max grew older, and the once vivid bond between father and son began to fray. By the time Max was a teenager, their conversations had dwindled to curt exchanges, their moments of connection replaced by silence. The breaking point came on a stormy night when Max, now 17, confronted Victor in a heated argument. "You were never there for me," Max had shouted, his voice cracking with years of pent-up frustration. "You care more about work than you ever cared about me." Victor, caught off guard, had responded with anger, his own guilt and exhaustion fueling his words. "You think life's easy? I've done everything for you. You're just ungrateful." Max had left that night, slamming the door behind him. He never returned. The years that followed were a blur of regret and longing for Victor. Eleanor passed away not long after Max's departure, her heartbroken gaze etched into Victor's memory. Alone in the house that once echoed with laughter, Victor found solace in an unlikely source: toys. At first, it was a small gesture, a single action figure he spotted at a flea market that reminded him of the ones Max used to play with. Then it was another and another. Before long, Victor's home transformed into a veritable museum of memories and penance. He spent his days scouring thrift stores, garage sales, and online auctions, searching for pieces to add to his ever-growing collection. Each toy he acquired felt like a small step toward redeeming the promise he had broken. He imagined Max walking through the door one day, seeing the collection, and understanding that it was all for him. The thought kept Victor going, even as his pension dwindled and his health deteriorated. But the world outside didn't understand Victor's mission. His neighbors whispered about the crazy old man who wasted his money on junk. They sneered at his disheveled appearance, his threadbare clothes, and the overgrown lawn of his property. "Why doesn't he spend that money on fixing his house?" they would mutter. "Why doesn't he act like a normal person?" Victor paid them no mind. His world revolved around his collection and the memories it represented. He often found himself talking to the toys, imagining conversations with Max. "This one's for you, buddy," he'd say, holding up a vintage fire truck. "Remember how you used to love these?" Despite the ridicule and isolation, Victor's dedication never wavered. Each toy he purchased brought a bittersweet mix of joy and pain, a reminder of the bond he had lost and the hope that, perhaps, it could be restored. He lived frugally, surviving on canned soup and the kindness of strangers. Every spare penny went toward his collection, which now filled every corner of his home. On particularly lonely nights, Victor would sit in his favorite armchair, surrounded by his treasures, and let his mind wander. He imagined Max as a grown man, walking through the door with a smile and saying, "Dad, you did it. You kept your promise." The vision always brought tears to Victor's eyes, a mix of sorrow and longing that he couldn't put into words. And so, the days turned into months, and the months into years. Victor Malone, the quiet collector, lived for a dream that no one else could see, a dream that kept him going, even as the weight of time bore down on him. Little did he know, the world was about to take notice of his peculiar mission, and his life would change in ways he could never have imagined. The past haunted Victor like a shadow, clinging to his every thought. His days surrounded by toys reflected a life consumed by regret. Each piece in his collection wasn't just a trinket. It was a fragment of a broken promise, a reminder of Max, the bright-eyed boy he had once failed. Alone in his cluttered home, the toys became more than just objects. They were pieces of the bond Victor had lost, fragments of the love he had never fully shown. Victor often sat among the chaos, lost in memories of what could have been. He could still hear Max's laughter as a child, see him lying on the floor, orchestrating grand adventures with his spaceman toys. Those fleeting moments had been the happiest of Victor's life, but they had faded into silence, first emotional, then physical. To the world outside, he was a lonely old man wasting his money on junk. To Victor, though, each toy was a bridge to his son, a silent apology for years of neglect, a testament to the love he had left unspoken. One crisp morning, Victor stumbled upon something unexpected while sorting through a box of toys he had picked up at a flea market. Hidden among chipped figurines was a small leather notebook. Its yellowed pages contained a child's journal, filled with dreams and doodles. The boy, Danny, had written about becoming an astronaut, imagining himself soaring through the stars. Each page spoke of innocence, ambition, and an unshakable belief in the extraordinary. Victor couldn't put it down. The words reminded him of Max, of the stories they used to create together, of the bond he once thought unbreakable. The journal stirred something deep within him. It reignited a determination Victor thought he had lost. The collection had to be completed, not just for Max, but for himself. It was the one thing he could still do to make things right, to honor the promise he had failed to keep. With renewed focus, Victor scoured estate sales, thrift shops, and online auctions. Each toy he found felt like another step closer to redemption, a chance to rebuild the bridge to his son. One day, while browsing an auction site, Victor found a listing that made his heart race. It was a rare vintage astronaut figure, the very kind Max had once dreamed of. Its pristine condition, complete with the original packaging, made it a collector's dream. For Victor, it was far more than that. This wasn't just a toy, it was a fragment of Max's childhood, a piece of the bond they had shared. Despite the high price, Victor placed his bid, heart pounding as the timer ticked down. When the auction closed and he saw he had won, tears filled his eyes. The package arrived days later, and Victor unwrapped it with trembling hands. Holding the figure, he felt a rush of joy and sorrow. It was as though a piece of Max had returned to him. He placed the astronaut on the mantel, the centerpiece of his collection. It became the crown jewel of his treasures, a symbol of unyielding hope. But Victor's relentless pursuit came at a cost. His pension, already stretched thin, could no longer sustain him. He skipped meals, stopped heating his home, and sold off his remaining belongings. His health, fragile to begin with, began to decline. A persistent cough worsened as the winter chill seeped into his unheated house. Yet Victor pressed on. His mission was clear: to finish the collection for Max, no matter the sacrifice. The neighbors began to notice Victor's decline. Some pitied him, others whispered cruelly about his obsession. "He's wasting his money on toys," they said. "He brought this on himself." Victor ignored their words. His focus remained unshaken. He imagined the day Max would walk through the door and see what he had done. "Dad, you kept your promise," he pictured Max saying. That thought kept him alive, even as his body grew weaker. One snowy evening, while rearranging his collection, Victor spotted something he hadn't noticed in years: a tattered envelope tucked between books on the mantel. Its yellowed paper bore Max's handwriting. Victor's breath caught as he carefully opened it. The letter, dated 20 years earlier, spoke of anger, forgiveness, and hope. Max admitted he had struggled to forgive Victor for his absence during his childhood, but wrote that he had never stopped loving him. He dreamed of returning home to mend their bond, even mentioning the toy collection they had once dreamed of completing together. Tears streamed down Victor's face as he read. All these years he had thought he was forgotten, but Max's words carried a glimmer of hope. Max was still out there, perhaps waiting, just as Victor had been waiting for him. Clutching the letter, Victor made a decision. The collection was no longer just a promise, it was a bridge, a way back to his son. He resolved to see Max again, no matter what sacrifices lay ahead. The toys, the collection, and the memories they held were no longer just his refuge. They were his hope, his path toward redemption, and a chance to reclaim the love he had once lost. Victor's decision to find Max consumed him. The letter he had discovered, with its words of forgiveness and longing, became his guiding light. He clutched it tightly, reading and rereading it every night as if the words would reveal the path to his son. But time was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand, and Victor knew he couldn't wait much longer. His body, weakened by years of neglect and malnutrition, reminded him daily of his frailty. Every cough rattled his chest, every shiver from the cold night sent waves of pain through his joints. Yet he pressed on. Max was out there somewhere, and Victor would not rest until he found him. Selling off the collection was unthinkable, but Victor knew he needed funds to search for his son. The toys were his lifeline, his reason for living, yet they were also the key to reuniting with Max. The decision to part with them weighed heavily on him. "What good are these toys if I never see him again?" he muttered to himself one freezing night, staring at the mantel where the astronaut figure stood proudly. The next morning, Victor made the call. He reached out to a reputable auction house, one that specialized in rare collectibles. The toys he had spent decades acquiring were appraised, their value far exceeding what Victor had imagined. "This is an extraordinary collection," the appraiser told him. "It could fetch a small fortune." A small fortune. The words echoed in Victor's mind as he signed the papers authorizing the auction. The collection he had built for Max was no longer his to keep. It felt like losing a piece of himself, but he reminded himself of the letter, of Max's words, and of the promise he had made long ago. News of the auction spread quickly. Collectors from around the country flocked to bid on Victor's treasures. The event garnered media attention, with reporters calling it the auction of a lifetime. Victor watched from the back of the crowded room as strangers raised their paddles, claiming the toys he had sacrificed so much for. Each piece that sold felt like a farewell to a memory, a goodbye to a part of his soul. When the auction ended, Victor sat quietly as the final tally was calculated. The proceeds were enough to fund his search for Max and leave him with a modest amount to live on. It was more money than he had ever seen, yet it felt empty in his hands. The toys were gone, but the hope they represented remained. Victor hired a private investigator, a man named Samuel Reese, to help him track down Max. Samuel was kind but pragmatic. "Finding someone after 20 years won't be easy," he warned. "Do you have any idea where he might be?" Victor handed Samuel the letter, his only clue. "This is all I have," he said quietly. The search began slowly. Weeks turned into months, and Victor grew more anxious with each passing day. Samuel provided periodic updates, but the trail was cold. Max had left little trace of himself over the years. "People disappear for all sorts of reasons," Samuel explained during one of their meetings. "Sometimes they don't want to be found." Victor refused to believe that Max didn't want to be found. The letter had been proof enough. Max had wanted to come home. He had just been waiting for the right time, and Victor was determined to make that time now. As the investigation continued, Victor busied himself with what little remained of his collection. He had kept only a handful of toys, ones too sentimental to part with. Among them was the astronaut figure, still perched on the mantel. It became a symbol of his hope, a reminder of why he couldn't give up. During these long months, Victor found himself reflecting more deeply on his failures. He remembered moments when he could have been there for Max but had chosen work instead. He thought of the toys he had promised to buy but never did. The weight of those regrets was unbearable, but they also fueled his resolve. He could not undo the past, but he could fight for the future. One evening, as Victor sat by the fire, Samuel called with news. "We've found something," he said. Victor's heart raced as Samuel explained. Max had been living under a different name, working odd jobs in a small town several hundred miles away. It wasn't much, but it was a lead, a chance. The journey to find Max would not be easy. Victor's health was deteriorating rapidly, and the winter cold was unforgiving. But he was resolute. With Samuel's help, he arranged transportation and prepared for the trip. The night before he left, he sat in his armchair staring at the astronaut figure. "I'm coming for you, Max," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. The next morning, bundled in layers to protect against the cold, Victor set out on what he hoped would be the final leg of his journey. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he carried with him the hope of reconciliation, the promise of a reunion that had kept him alive through decades of loneliness. Victor's resolve burned brighter than ever. No matter what lay ahead, he would see his son again, and this time he would keep his promise. Victor's journey to find Max was fraught with challenges. The cold wind seemed to seep into his bones as he traveled unfamiliar roads. Samuel had provided the address of a small apartment complex where Max might be living. It was a destination Victor had dreamed of for years, yet now that it was so close, fear and anticipation mingled in his heart. The physical toll on Victor's body was undeniable. Every breath felt heavier, his persistent cough rattling his frail frame. Even with layers of clothing, the winter cold was relentless. Yet he pressed on. "You've come this far," he told himself. "Don't give up now." When he arrived at the apartment complex, it was old and weathered, its peeling paint and broken steps a reflection of his own fragility. Victor stood before the building, gripping his cane tightly. The letter in his pocket felt impossibly heavy, as though it carried the weight of 20 years. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what you've been waiting for." The apartment number was on the second floor. Each step up the creaking staircase was a test of his will. His legs trembled, his breath came in shallow gasps, but he kept going. By the time he reached the landing, he leaned against the wall, clutching his cane for support. "Not now," he muttered. "You can't stop now." Finally, he stood before the door marked 204. His hand shook as he reached for the doorbell. What if Max didn't want to see him? What if it was too late? He clenched his cane tightly, forcing himself to steady his breathing. With trembling fingers, he pressed the button. The faint sound of the doorbell echoed within, and Victor held his breath. For a few agonizing moments, there was silence. Then, footsteps. The door creaked open, and Victor's heart raced. Standing before him was Max. Older now, his face hardened by time. His once bright eyes, now clouded with confusion, scanned Victor's face. "Dad?" Max's voice was barely above a whisper. Tears filled Victor's eyes. "It's me. Max. I've been looking for you." Max hesitated, his expression unreadable. Then, as though deciding in that moment, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said softly. The apartment was small and modest, its furniture worn but functional. It was warm, a welcome reprieve from the biting cold outside. Victor eased himself into a chair by the window, his body grateful for the rest. Max sat across from him, his hands clasped tightly together, his expression guarded. The silence between them was heavy, filled with years of unspoken words. "I didn't know if I'd ever find you," Victor began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so many years. I didn't know if you'd want to see me." Max's gaze softened slightly, though he said nothing. Victor reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the letter. "I found this," he said, holding it out. "It's what kept me going." Max hesitated before taking the letter. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper and began to read. The words he had written so long ago stared back at him, a reflection of a younger man filled with anger and longing. "I wrote this when I thought I'd never see you again," Max said quietly. "I was so angry, but I missed you too." Victor nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. "I know I failed you, Max. I wasn't the father you deserved. I thought working hard, providing for you, was enough. I see now that I was wrong." Max looked away, his jaw tightening. "Why now?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Why, after all this time?" Victor took a deep breath, his chest heaving with the effort. "Because I couldn't let the last thing you remember about me be disappointment. I've spent years trying to make up for the promise I broke, collecting toys to show you that you mattered to me, even if I couldn't show it back then." Max's gaze fell on a single toy Victor had brought with him, a small astronaut figure. It sat on the table between them, its pristine condition a testament to Victor's dedication. Max's eyes softened as he looked at it, the walls he had built over the years beginning to crumble. For hours they talked. Their words were tentative at first, cautious, as though testing the fragile bridge they were rebuilding. But as the minutes passed, the conversation grew warmer. Victor shared stories of his search, of the sacrifices he had made, and of the hope that had kept him alive. Max listened, his expression shifting as he allowed himself to feel the emotions he had buried for so long. By the time the sun set, the air between them felt lighter, though the weight of the past remained. Max stood and walked to the kitchen, returning with 2 mugs of tea. "I don't know if we can fix everything," he said, setting a mug in front of Victor. "But maybe we can try." Victor smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "That's all I want," he said softly. "Just a chance to try." For the first time in decades, father and son sat together, sharing not just tea but the hope of a future where the wounds of the past might finally begin to heal. As they spoke late into the night, Victor felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the tea or the apartment's heater. It was hope that it wasn't too late to rebuild what had been broken. The days following Victor and Max's reunion were a delicate dance between hope and uncertainty. For Victor, every moment spent with his son felt like a fragile gift. He found himself treading carefully, unsure of how much of the past could be healed, or if it was too late to mend their bond entirely. Max, too, seemed cautious. Though he had welcomed Victor into his home, his words carried a hesitancy, as if the years of separation had built a wall too high to break down in a day. Victor stayed in a nearby motel, his modest savings dwindling quickly. Each morning, he made the short walk to Max's apartment, eager to spend whatever time he could with his son. Their conversations were slow and measured, often circling around lighter topics: Max's job, the weather, the town. Victor longed to dive deeper, to understand what Max's life had been like all these years, but he held back, afraid of pushing too hard. Max, in turn, seemed torn. He had so many questions, so much anger buried over the decades, yet seeing his father in such a frail state softened him. He watched Victor, now a shadow of the man he remembered, struggle to hide his pain. There were moments when Max wanted to ask why Victor hadn't reached out sooner, why work had consumed him, why he had made Max feel so unimportant, but the words never came. Instead, they sat in silence, sipping tea, the unspoken tension between them palpable. One morning, Victor arrived to find Max staring at the astronaut figure on the mantel. Max's fingers traced its edges as he spoke. "I remember this," he said quietly. "I used to dream about having one of these when I was a kid." Victor stepped closer, his heart aching. "I found it for you," he said softly. "I wanted you to know that I never forgot. Not even for a day." Max turned, his eyes searching. "Why now, Dad? Why did it take you so long to come looking for me?" Victor sank into a chair, his frail body trembling under the weight of his emotions. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't want to see me. Afraid I'd hurt you too much to make it right. But when I found your letter, it gave me hope. Maybe it wasn't too late." Max sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You have no idea how many times I wanted to come back," he said, "but I didn't know if you'd even care. You were always too busy for me, always somewhere else." Victor's voice cracked. "I thought providing for you was enough, but I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Max. I failed you." Max turned back to the astronaut figure, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said, "I used to imagine you playing with me. I'd pretend you were right there, making the spacemen talk, going on adventures with me. I guess I was always waiting for you." Victor's heart broke anew. "I can't fix the past," he said, "but I'm here now, and I want to try." Max hesitated before meeting his father's gaze. "It is late," he said, "but maybe we still have time." Their days together grew longer as the weeks passed. Victor's health continued to decline, his cough worsening despite Max's insistence he see a doctor. But Victor refused. "I don't want to waste the time we have," he said. "I just want to be with you." Max began caring for his father in small ways, bringing him tea, cooking meals, making sure he had blankets. These gestures, simple as they were, became the foundation of their fragile new relationship. Slowly, the walls between them began to fall. One afternoon, as they watched the snow fall outside, Victor broke the silence. "Do you remember the promise I made when you were little, about building the biggest toy collection in the world?" Max smiled faintly. "I remember. You never kept it." Victor chuckled weakly. "I tried. After you left, I started collecting. It was my way of holding on to you. I thought if I ever saw you again, it would show how much I cared." Max looked at his father, his expression softening. "You didn't need toys to show me that," he said. "I just wanted you." The words hit Victor harder than anything else. He reached out, his frail hand resting on Max's. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand," he said. One evening, as Victor's cough worsened, Max finally convinced him to see a doctor. The visit confirmed what Max had feared. Victor's health was rapidly deteriorating. "You need rest, Dad," Max said, his voice firm but gentle. "And I'll be here to make sure you get it." Victor, though weary, smiled. "I'm lucky to have you, Max." In quiet moments, Max shared pieces of his life, stories of mistakes he'd made, struggles he'd overcome. Victor listened intently, offering the encouragement he had failed to give before. The conversations brought them closer, slowly filling the chasm that years of silence had created. For the first time in decades, Victor felt peace. He had found his son, and though their time might be brief, it was enough. They had each other again, and that was all that mattered. Sitting together, father and son, they faced the future with a quiet hope that perhaps, even after all this time, they could still find joy in the days they had left. The final days of Victor's life were both heartbreaking and beautiful. As winter deepened, so did his frailty, his body weakened by years of hardship and neglect. But despite the pain and exhaustion, he found himself smiling more often than he had in decades. He had what he had yearned for: time with Max. Though brief, these days were filled with quiet conversations, shared meals, and a closeness Victor had once thought impossible. Max, now fully aware of the severity of his father's condition, became his caretaker. It was a role he never imagined he'd take on, yet one he embraced with a mix of tenderness and quiet determination. Every morning he prepared tea and made sure Victor was warm, wrapping him in blankets and adjusting the small heater in his apartment. He learned to recognize the signs of Victor's discomfort, the moments when his breathing grew labored or his hands trembled too much to hold a cup. These small acts of care became Max's way of showing the love he had buried for so long. Victor, in turn, tried to savor every moment. He shared stories from his past, ones Max had never heard before. He spoke of his dreams and regrets, of the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned too late. "If I could do it all over again," he told Max one evening, his voice faint, "I'd choose you every time. No job, no amount of money could ever be worth missing out on you." Max listened intently, his own emotions raw. "I used to think you didn't care," he admitted, "but now I see that you just didn't know how to show it." Victor reached for Max's hand, his grip weak but steady. "I wish I had been better," he said, "but having these days with you, it's more than I deserve." As the snow fell outside, the world around them seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath for what was to come. Max took time off work to be with Victor, knowing their time together was running out. The once tense air between them had softened, replaced by a gentle understanding. They spoke of everything and nothing, their words weaving a tapestry of memories, forgiveness, and love. One afternoon, Max brought out the astronaut figure from the mantel, placing it on the table between them. "You know," he said, smiling faintly, "I don't think I ever told you, but this was my favorite toy. Even before I had it, I used to imagine it sitting on my shelf." Victor's eyes, though heavy with fatigue, lit up with a quiet joy. "I always knew you'd love it," he said. "That's why I had to find it for you. It was my way of keeping you close, even when you were far away." Max nodded, his gaze fixed on the figure. "It's funny," he said. "For so many years, I thought I wanted this toy, but now I realize all I ever wanted was you." The words hung in the air, filling the room with a warmth neither of them had felt in years. Victor's lips trembled as he smiled. "And you have me now," he said softly. "For however long I have left, I'm yours." That night, Victor's condition worsened. Max stayed by his side, holding his hand as Victor struggled to breathe. The weight of what was happening settled over them, unspoken but understood. Max fought back tears, determined to be strong for his father. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Victor's eyes, though dim, shone with a love that words could not convey. He squeezed Max's hand weakly. "Thank you," he whispered, "for finding me, for giving me this chance." As the hours passed, the room grew still. Victor's breathing slowed, each breath a struggle. Max stayed with him, refusing to leave his side. When the end finally came, it was peaceful. Victor slipped away, his hand still in Max's, a faint smile on his lips. The days that followed were a blur for Max. He handled the arrangements, leaning on the strength he didn't know he had. Though the grief was overwhelming, there was also a sense of peace. Max had found his father, and in those final days, they had found each other. After the funeral, Max returned to his apartment. The place felt emptier without Victor, but it also held the memories of their time together. On the mantel, the astronaut figure still sat, a symbol of the bond they had shared. Max picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "I'll take care of this," he said aloud, as if Victor could hear him. "I'll take care of us." Over time, Max began to rebuild his life. He carried Victor's lessons with him, letting them guide his choices. He found himself reaching out to people he had lost touch with, mending relationships that had frayed over the years. And though the pain of losing his father remained, it was tempered by the knowledge that they had made peace. The astronaut figure stayed on the mantel, a constant reminder of the love that had brought them back together. Max would often look at it and smile, remembering the man who had spent a lifetime searching for redemption and had finally found it in the love of his son. In the end, Victor's greatest legacy wasn't the toys he had collected or the promises he had made. It was the bond he had rebuilt with Max, the love that had survived decades of pain and silence. And for Max, that love was enough to carry him forward, one day at a time.